An act of God. Have you seen that phrase before? Probably on an insurance form or somewhere in your policy. If you ever read through that, you might see an act of God referred to. And that can be kind of an odd thing. You wonder exactly what does that mean, and generally it means an unforeseen event that is beyond human control, that just kind of happens. Maybe it's weather or something else that affects or even sometimes damages your person or property. That's considered an act of God, and your insurance agent might explain it to you that way, that it's just kind of a random event that might cause damage. When we look in God's Word, we see an awful lot of acts of God. And they aren't really random, are they? They're very carefully thought out. They're planned. They are beyond human control. They are something that only God can do. And they aren't just damaging. They actually save and rescue people, or they advance God's plan to save you and to save me. That's especially true in this first miracle that we are looking at in this worship series based on miracles. We are looking at an act of God in which he delivered the Israelites from the hands of the Egyptians by parting the Red Sea, allowing them to cross on dry land. I think it's good for us to start with a miracle like that, one that many people are familiar with. You're probably even well aware of what led up to the parting of the Red Sea. But just as a very quick refresher, you know that the people of Israel were living as slaves in Egypt. The Egyptians enslaved the Israelites and forced them into labor, particular kind of labor where they were forming mud into bricks and making bricks so that they could build buildings and things like that. That's what the Israelites were doing there in Egypt. And God had appointed Moses to go and free the people from Egypt and bring them into a promised land, a land of their very own. So Moses, kind of reluctantly at first, he went up to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh, of course, said no. And Moses went again and made the same request or demand, saying, "God has sent me. You need to let my people go." Pharaoh says no, and so God then sends a series of 10 plagues to kind of force Pharaoh's hand into releasing the Israelite slaves. And after the 10th plague, Pharaoh finally says, "Okay, fine, that's enough, no more. The Hebrew people can go. Just get out of my sight." So the Israelites, they pack up and they take everything. They leave as quickly as they can. But then before long, Pharaoh changes his mind. He says, "Wait a second, I just let all of my free labor go. Who is going to make all these bricks now?" So he sends the armies out, leads the armies out after the Israelites to bring them back. That's where our lesson picks up today, where the Israelites are fleeing from the Egyptians, and now they've kind of run into a dead end because they can't go forward anymore. Only the Red Sea is in front of them. Now behind them is only the Egyptian armies. This is what we read in Exodus chapter 14. It says, "As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, 'Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert.'" Now, on the one hand, you really can't blame them for their lack of faith here, right? It really did seem like a hopeless situation. And looking back on it, they thought, slavery was bad, but at least we had a place to sleep. At least we had, food to eat. At least we had a chance to live, unlike our current circumstances where we're obviously going to be killed out here. Why did you lead us out here, Moses? And this person that they followed out into the desert didn't really have a great track record of being a great leader. He wasn't even really one of the Hebrew people. I mean, he was one of them, but he didn't know what it was like to grow up as a slave. He grew up in the palace, far from the mud pits where they were hand-packing all of these bricks. He grew up in luxury, and now he's coming to lead us out, saying that God had appointed him to be our leader, to lead us to freedom, to lead us to a promised land. Look where that brought us. Out here into the desert. To a dead end. It's no wonder that they were complaining. No wonder that they had a lack of faith. And yet, on the other hand, you could argue that they should have had a little more faith here. Because they had just witnessed 10 acts of God in a row that were complete miracles, plagues that were sent among the Egyptians, the frogs and the hail and the darkness, turning the Nile River into blood. An angel of death went through the whole country of Egypt, and yet miraculously all of the Hebrew children survived. They had witnessed the physical presence of the Lord in the form of a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. They had seen all of this, and they had every reason to believe that Moses was the leader that God had appointed, because he came bearing that name, declaring to them that the great I Am has sent me to you. They had every reason to believe that Moses was that appointed leader, and so they had every reason to believe that God was going to deliver them here, and yet they didn't. They complained, they cried out, "Why have you brought us out here to die? Weren't there enough graves in Egypt?" Because in front of them they saw only the Red Sea, and behind them they saw the Egyptians closing in. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance that the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." That's true for most of our battles, isn't it? That the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on." Well, move on. Move on where? He says, "Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Then in verse 21 it says that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. Now, up until that point, it might seem like this is an ordinary run-of-the-mill act of God, where there is a wind and the water is receding because the waves are being pushed in a certain direction and dry land appears. But then if you read on, it says that the waters were divided and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That is no natural phenomenon. This is an outright miracle, an impossibility happening right before the very eyes of hundreds of thousands of Israelites and the Egyptians as well. And the Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let us go away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. Now, this is truly one of the most memorable moments from the Bible. I think many people are aware, you don't have to grow up going to Sunday school to be aware that this event took place.